Tonight on Brian Ross Investigates, the safety expert hired by USA Swimming to protect its young athletes from sexual assault and abuse by coaches now testifies the sport ignored his warnings and recommendations.
Was that recommendation followed?
Not in the way that we had proposed.
Will the president of USA Swimming be able to keep his job after testifying he never even read the sport's code of conduct?
I have not read it before.
Plus, the Thomas Crown affair in real life. Two major art thefts overseas. The former head of security at America's premier art museum weighs in. Is the priceless art inside here safe?
Could someone steal a Vermeer from your museum?
I can't say no. I mean, it's possible.
How would they do it?
I'm not going to tell you.
And our shout out for the college newspaper doing it right, prepared to take on veteran beloved professors and the school administration, whatever the consequences.
The fact that all of a sudden someone that you've seen as a mentor and interacted with so personally is now, there's an article that's alleging that he's been committing sexual misconduct and harassment for 40 years.
From the Law&Crime Network studios in New York City's Herald Square, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening and welcome. We'll soon be hearing about the coming Summer Olympics being held in Tokyo this year, with American athletes already deep into their training programs to make the U.S. team. But what may mar this glorious event are the continued reports of sexual abuse of athletes by coaches in a number of sports, with several lawsuits scheduled to begin just as the games and the trials are getting underway. Tonight, some new and troubling insights into how one sport, USA Swimming, has handled or failed to handle the troubling issues. In court last month, testimony revealed a serious gap between a rosy picture being painted for the public and the harsh reality. Here's the testimony of a renowned sexual abuse expert, Dr. Victor Veith, who was hired by USA Swimming only to have his recommendations ignored.
As part of this project, is it true that Gunderson and you recommended that USA Swimming mandate that parents, both members of USA Swimming and parents of children who are members of USA Swimming, undergo sex abuse training?
We recommended that, yes.
Was that recommendation followed?
Not in the way that we had proposed. We proposed a requirement, and they proposed they were going to do it in a different way, the incentive-based model.
What is your opinion as to the difference between requiring parental training versus an incentive-based program as far as whether or not children are vulnerable to sex abuse?
Broader than just my work on this case, but 30 years of experience. Parents just aren't going to do it voluntarily very often. You don't know what you...
That testimony was taken by lawyer Robert Allard, who now joins us from California by Skype. Mr. Allard, you sued USA Swimming on behalf of a young swimmer who was sexually molested by her coach in Stockton, California, but the jury found in favor of USA Swimming. Does that mean that USA Swimming has been doing everything right?
Well, the verdict came after a $1.125 million settlement on behalf of USA Swimming's regional arm here in California called Pacific Swimming, as well as its member club in Stockton entitled the Stockton Swim Club. So this was simply a case against the national organization, and based upon discussions we had with the jury, the decision had nothing to do with any assessment of USA Swimming's child protection program, if you want to call it that, and everything to do with the unique facts of our case. They did not like some of the things they heard about the supervision of the parents in particular, and that was the motivating factor behind their decision.
So they sort of blamed the victim's parents in a way. The testimony of Victor Veith was that USA Swimming decided not to require training for parents and children, but to have an incentive-based model. What's the difference there, and what's the impact of that?
Well, the incentive-based program really is, for lack of a better term, laughable. What they are saying is that those who do the training get added perks like pizza parties and things like that. You will not find, for example, any reduction in fees to USA Swimming if people undergo the training, which is really what you should be doing if you really want to incentivize parents. But Victor Veith was the renowned expert chosen by USA Swimming to do a complete assessment of its program. He clearly told them that the voluntary program, as far as training, was not working. The information was not getting out there. The statistics were very underwhelming, and recommended that they mandate training, very valuable training to educate children how to protect themselves from predators, and parents to learn about how these predators work and to try to cut off the abuse by recognizing warning signs before the abuse occurs. There's really just no reason why they didn't do that other than it was just too much trouble, is what we heard.
And what's the impact required would be perhaps, in the 90% people performing the requirements and the training. What about this case with the incentive? How widespread the training becomes?
Well, in this case that we handled recently in Stockton, no one had undergone safe sport training. No one had even heard of safe sport in particular. There was literally nothing by way of child protection measures at this club whatsoever. And this is an example as to things we're finding out about as we deal with these cases across the country. Over and over again, valuable information by way of training and education is not getting to the grassroots level where the predators prey on kids, and that's the most important level.
You also took the testimony of USA Swimming President and CEO Tim Hinchey, who told you under oath he had never read the U.S. Swimming Code of Conduct. Here's a portion of that testimony.
Do you know enough about grooming, sir, that it takes place over time?
I'm not familiar with how grooming takes place.
And when Hinchey was shown training material produced by U.S. Swimming itself, laying out the warning signs that predators can display in grooming victims, Hinchey admitted he had never ever read it in the 3 years he has run USA Swimming.
This is information which is disseminated by USA Swimming as part of its training program, is it not?
I have not read it before.
Have you ever assessed whether or not pedophiles are particularly attracted to the sport of swimming?
I have not.
Again and again, Hinchey admitted his lack of knowledge about the subject.
I'm just not familiar with all the examples of grooming. Again, I don't have the expertise to answer that. I just don't have the expertise as it relates to identifying what grooming is.
Before I read this information to you, had you been previously made aware of this information?
Not that I'm reading today.
And Hinchey admitted he was even unfamiliar with the USA Swimming Code of Conduct.
At any point in time, did you receive any type of training on USA Swimming's Code of Conduct?
I did not.
As you sit here today, have you ever reviewed in its entirety USA Swimming's Code of Conduct?
I have not.
Stunning testimony, Mr. Aller. Were you surprised he admitted to you he had never even read the Code of Conduct for the sport that he runs?
I was stunned, especially since their position is that parents and children should voluntarily take on their own time review the training materials. Now, how, as an executive making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, you expect these parents and these kids to spend the time to train themselves when he himself hasn't even done it? What's stunning to me also is that almost 95% of USA Swimming's members are children. So what you're saying is that you understand that there are pedophiles out there and that they are affecting this sport uniquely, and yet you're not spending any time to train yourself as to how predators get access to children. It's beyond stunning to me.
Indeed. Bob Allard, a question to you from our control room from executive producer Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
You said you didn't get exactly the outcome you wanted in terms of suing USA Swimming. Will this affect upcoming cases? You have another big case coming up, right?
Yes, we do. We represent Ariana Cookers, and if anything, this will benefit us because we've now been through the process. We now know how they defend these cases, and the facts present in that case in particular are far different than they were in this case. So we see it as an advantage as far as us learning in advance how they defend these cases, and more importantly, an expert they recently paid $110,000. Now imagine that $110,000 is the amount of money they paid to their expert to comment on their liability program. So we have an opportunity to depose her and cross-examine her at trial, and I understand she'll be testifying for them again, and she'll be a very wealthy lady.
Bob Ballard, what's it going to take for USA Swimming to essentially wake up to this problem? They seem to be putting their head in the sand.
Yeah, the indifference shown by Mr. Hinchy tells me that this still is just not even on their radar. It's not something they're paying attention to. And frankly, I don't think it's anything they care about. They can say all they want about how this is important, about how this is a commitment they're making, but what I see are things at the ground level. I see what happens to the children when they're interacting with the coaches. And I'm here to tell you that with the clubs I have dealt with, children are not protected from predators at these clubs. And until they wake up and do something drastic, at least do what their own expert tells them to do, it's going to continue.
So you're seeing continued cases of sexual assaults and abuse by the coaches against these young swimmers?
We get calls weekly from swim clubs all across the country, and I have yet to see a club with a child protection program that is satisfactory and that will adequately protect these kids. So if that sampling size is a representation as to how it's happening across the country, if I were a parent and I was considering putting my child in a swim program, I would think again.
And all this with the Olympics coming up and USA Swimming playing a big role.
Yeah, we see a lot of attention about the Olympic Games and, millions of dollars in corporate sponsorships and the Google Awards, whatever they have for their goggles. And I don't see anything as far as money spent and time devoted to an issue which clearly needs to be resolved.
All right, Bob Ballard, thank you so much for joining us tonight. By the way, we tried to reach out for USA Swimming's comment and no reaction to our requests. Thanks, Bob, for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Up next, after a major museum art theft in Germany, we'll talk with the man who ran security at America's premier art museum. Could it happen here? Big news in the world of art and crime these past few weeks with two daring museum break-ins and the loss of priceless works. So we wondered if U.S. museums could be just as vulnerable and set out to meet someone who should know the answer. Both thefts were in Germany. Communist-era medals and jewelry taken from a museum in Berlin. Clearly an acquired taste, but still valued in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And of more significance, a theft at Dresden's Royal Palace.
The thieves made off with a priceless haul of jewelry.
Where thieves, seen briefly on surveillance cameras, apparently disabled the museum's alarm system by starting a fire, and then made off with 18th century jewelry.
Officials say the stolen jewelry could be worth up to $1 billion.
It's the kind of thing that still worries the official who set up security at America's premier art museum, John Barelli, who's written a new book, Stealing the Show, about his more than 3 decades at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There's probably no bigger target, he acknowledges, given the art treasures inside.
Well, I don't think any place has anything like the Met in this country or, possibly in the world. The thing about the Met and what's in it are the objects that are priceless and irreplaceable. You can't replace them.
Do you have a sense that thieves regularly case your museum? Check it out to see if there are any openings, any little deviations they can take advantage of?
Yeah, I'm sure it's done every day by visitors. And then we have the professional, or the person who plans something to take, as they did at the Gardner Museum.
The theft at the Gardner Museum in Boston was almost 30 years ago and remains unsolved despite a $10 million reward. Empty frames hang where works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Degas once were on display.
We've seen the Thomas Crown affair. Think of art thieves like that. Could they pull off a big theft at the Metropolitan Museum of Art?
Anything's possible, but
in your view,
I think it's Hollywood, basically.
Even so, some items did go missing while Barelli was in charge. Most notably, this Grecian head, which was later recovered, even though the person who took it remains a mystery to this day.
It was the first time, this is interesting, it was the first time in the museum's existence that a piece of art was taken from a public area. Well, the head wasn't secured properly to begin with, and the person had an opportunity where he was able, we say he because it was 23 pounds. It was a heavy head. Concealed it and just ran out of the building.
The theft was front page news in New York.
And 5 days later, on Valentine's Day, we get a call from the Manhattan South that they've recovered the head out of a locker in Grand Central Station.
You're still trying to solve that case?
Yeah, yeah.
That's an open investigation?
Well, I'm sure the statute of limitations are over, but...
You'd like to know who took it and why?
Yeah, we would just like to know who took it. We want to know sort of what was in this person's mind, but as we investigate art theft, we really don't, and as you go further away from the theft, all you concentrate on is getting the piece back. Recovery becomes paramount.
So you would trade off recovering it for making an arrest?
Yeah, yeah. I think
the arrest is secondary?
It becomes that way, yeah. The art becomes more important. This priceless piece becomes more important.
So in your years there, your greatest achievement is there never was a major theft of anything out in public display. Could someone steal a Vermeer from your museum?
I can't say no. I mean, it's possible. It's possible.
How would they do it?
I'm not going to tell you.
That's right. Well, with the 30th anniversary of the break-in at Boston's Gardner Museum just a few months away, no doubt we'll be hearing a lot more about this. Up next, our shout-out for the student newspaper, prepared to take on popular professors and the school administration, whatever the consequences. And our shout-out tonight for a college newspaper whose beginner journalists, it seems, have been doing everything right. This comes at a time when the paper at Northwestern University, famed for its journalism school, has been heavily criticized for backing away and apologizing for a story that fairly covered a student demonstration. The demonstrators didn't like it. Too bad. So it's all the more impressive to highlight the work of the students at the University of Michigan, who have nothing to apologize for with their hard-hitting journalism at the Michigan Daily.
We're the only daily print publication in Ann Arbor. The Ann Arbor News shut its daily publication a few years ago, and since then we've been kind of functioning as both a school newspaper and a local newspaper.
Maya Goldman is barely old enough to buy a drink, but she runs a 300-person reporting staff as the editor-in-chief of the University of Michigan student newspaper, the Michigan Daily. It's a heavy obligation.
Yeah, it is. It's a big mantle, as my managing editor says. It's a lot of responsibility, but we take it very seriously. It's a privilege too, you know.
And they do it very well, with a more robust operation than many of the country's big city dailies still publishing, covering news from both the campus and from the city itself.
So that includes, news, sports, opinion, arts, but then we also have a really robust photo section, we have a video section, podcast, we have a weekly magazine called The Statement, we have a section that's specifically a creative expression section for students of color, we have a copy desk that edits pretty much every story that goes in the paper.
Newspapers may be dying in much of America, but this one seems alive and well in Ann Arbor.
But I think, especially after the 2016 election, a lot of young people were more interested in what is real and how can I tell for myself if this information is correct, and getting involved in the, a renewed urgency to have a really strong freedom of the press and a strong media culture.
And with a recent investigative report about a music professor accused of sexual misconduct, Goldman and her staff quickly learned how to stand up to pressure from those who don't want some stories published.
Do you really know what you're doing? Do you really know how this will affect people and how this will affect the school? But you know, we're completely independent from the university. We don't receive any funding from them. They have no ownership over our content. So, you know, in that regard, there was never really a question.
The story was about Professor Stephen Shipps, reported by Sammy Sussman, who uncovered undisclosed allegations of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, and sexual relationships with teenage students going back nearly 40 years.
It was my first time taking on any sort of investigative reporting type story.
Sussman, a music school student himself, had to deal with divided loyalties to his school and to his paper.
I think that crossed my mind really early in the reporting process before I kind of understood the extent of the alleged misconduct that was taking place. I will say that some faculty members, I'm a music student as I said, so some faculty members definitely pushed back at me a bit for taking on this reporting and damaging the brand, but I don't think it ever came from kind of the official university channels.
A big story for even a veteran reporter, not to mention someone just starting out in journalism.
There were a couple of sleepless nights during the reporting process. I mean, it's kind of horrible to say, but almost the amount of alleged abuse that we were able to uncover kind of made me less worried about what we were doing. I think he was allegedly doing this for 40 years at 3 separate academic institutions.
Sussman's story was picked up across the state, and the professor has since retired after being placed on leave by the university. The school says it is continuing to investigate.
We were lucky that Sammy, who was only a sophomore at that time, was able to keep reporting and, you know, wasn't a senior who was about to graduate. Having Sammy's example and seeing, at least for the staff now, seeing how much of a change that actually made on campus and how impactful that process was, I think it really inspired a lot of other people on our staff to want to do more of that.
Indeed. As someone who started as a student journalist in Iowa, there's no better training to be had than working for the school paper or radio or TV station. It can be challenging around the time of finals, but it's worth it. That's our program for tonight. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back here next week.